everybody in the back hear me all right? Is this a good volume for you guys? Doing okay? Okay. For those of you who just walked in, just in case, I'm Andrew. I'll be filling in for Dr. McCullough today. We'll go over cellular respiration a little bit, just kind of a review on stuff that maybe you've already talked about a little bit. And then we'll move into photosynthesis and talk about how plants get their energy. They have to do it just like any other cell does, but they have a different process that makes them special. So if, as far as a short review goes, hopefully you've already been introduced a little bit to glycolysis, which is what's occurring up there in the upper left. That's the breakdown of a sugar molecule in the cytoplasm of a cell. And eventually, your ending molecule is pyruvate, which is I believe it's a 3-carbon molecule. Please don't quote me on that. I can't exactly remember the structure in my notebook. But that is then shipped under normal aerobic conditions where there's oxygen present into an organelle called the mitochondria. And in there it undergoes further processing in a process known as the Krebs cycle, where we get our oxygen to release out into the environment. So when I breathe in, carbon dioxide is released in the environment. When I breathe in, I'm breathing in oxygen. Krebs cycle occurs in the mitochondria of my cells. And when I exhale, carbon dioxide comes out. And we'll take a closer look at how that process happens. But this is the source of the carbon dioxide that's coming out of our bodies. If you'll notice, pyruvate can also have another fate under anaerobic conditions, or when there's no oxygen present. And that's called anaerobic respiration. We'll take a look at how that occurs. So under anaerobic conditions, we're taking pyruvate that came from that glycolytic pathway. And just to reiterate, it can be shipped into the mitochondria where the Krebs or citric acid cycle occurs. If there's oxygen present, this is going to be the preferred method for the cell to produce its energy, because inside the mitochondria we can produce many molecules of ATP, which, as we've seen, is kind of like currency for the cell. It allows the cell to perform the functions that it has to perform. But the other fate of it is to undergo fermentation for backup energy when oxygen is not so abundant. And as we can see, the yield of ATP at the end is 2 molecules for 1 molecule of pyruvate. This is much less efficient, if you will, than the aerobic conditions, which can produce up to 32. So maybe you are familiar with the idea that yeast perform fermentation on glucose molecules?
No, go back.
Sure. Right here? Okay. What's really important here is just to note that the other fate for pyruvate is fermentation, where you only get 2 molecules of ATP. There are lots of words in the slide. You don't have to write them all down, I promise. Are we okay? Okay. Okay, I just had a very good question. The question was, does fermentation occur in the mitochondria? The answer is no. It actually occurs out in the cytosol of the cells, that fluid matrix that surrounds the mitochondria. And there's a reason for that. That's because it doesn't need to go into the mitochondria if it's undergoing respiration. That would just cost the cell extra energy. So this process does occur out in the cytosol. So we'll move on. So that process in yeast always starts with the glucose molecule or some other sugar molecule that ends up as glucose. It can be converted into these molecules of pyruvate. And rather than going into the mitochondria, it's going to be turned into this molecule called acetaldehyde. Before, there is a release of carbon dioxide, and our end product is ethanol. And we all benefit from this. We'll see how later. That's how it occurs in a yeast cell, which is a type of fungus. But the question is now, how does fermentation happen in animal cells, such as muscles? And the process is different. The principle is the same, but the end product is different. So as we'll see at the end, we get a buildup of lactic acid at the end of this fermentation pathway. So I don't know if you've ever ran and woken up and you're sore because you haven't run in a long time, and you feel your muscles are sore. That's usually the result of a buildup of this lactic acid that occurred in your muscles while you were exercising. And I also want to point out that this molecule called NADH that's coming off at the beginning is a form of energy-carrying molecule, much like ATP is. NADH has a different structure, but it does many of the same things. We can see at the end, it's also driving a reaction just like ATP does. The difference is that it gains and loses a hydrogen rather than a phosphorus, or a phosphate group, I should say. So this process does happen inside muscle tissue, and your muscle tissue are those elongated cells that can expand and contract to make your body move around and make you pick up things and enable you to run and exercise. And often there isn't enough of a chance for oxygen to get into those cells quickly enough. So anaerobic respiration is usually the pathway of choice to create energy in those muscles. So when you're running and you start breathing really heavily, your body is trying to give your muscles as much oxygen as it can so it can do as much aerobic respiration as it can. But that's not always enough, so it has this fermentation pathway in your muscle tissue. So what do you guys think? I see people reaching for their clickers. You don't have to today. But why don't we just talk about this question for a second and try to come up with some ideas on what's happening when you're sprinting. Does anybody have any ideas? Right. So why couldn't it be A then? Because oxygen is a limiting resource, that's right. Yep, very good. Oxygen can only move through your body so fast. When I'm running or if I'm lifting weights or something, my muscles do not have enough oxygen to go through the regular glycolytic pathway. But the glycolysis portion itself doesn't need the oxygen. What needs the oxygen is that aerobic respiration inside the mitochondria.
Which one is it?
The answer is C. Yep, I heard C before. So what does this mean in the regular world to people that aren't interested in the breakdown of the pathway and individual steps? Fermentation is responsible for many of our food and beverages. chemicals that produce energy for us. It's even used in the production of pharmaceuticals.